Recently, Elon Musk announced that he has discovered 14 computers inside the federal government that can make payments from nothing. They literally print the money or pay the money into existence. Now, I know what you're thinking. How is this any different than anything we've known has been going on for a very long time? And trust me, it is very different. This has nothing to do with all of the money printing the government has been doing that we've all known about through the banking system and the Federal Reserve. First, let's play the clip.
So I call a magic money computer any computer which can just make money out of thin air. That's magic money.
So how does that work?
It just issues payments.
And you said there's something like 11 of these computers at Treasury that are sending out trillions in payments?
They're mostly at Treasury. Some are, but there's some at HHS, some at, there's one or two at State, there's some at DOD. I think we found now 14 magic money computers.
14, okay.
They just send money out of nothing.
Now, again, even after watching that, you might be thinking, well, how is this different? We've known the government just creates dollars. So let me explain to you the way that so far we have understood this process to work. Step one, you make a deposit into your bank account. Let's say it comes from a paycheck. So you have $5,000 deposited into your bank account. Now that money doesn't just sit there because the bank has to make money in order to hold on to your money. They've got salaries to pay, they've got lights to keep on, buildings to pay the rent or the mortgage on. So they've got to do something with your dollars in order to turn a profit. What they will do is take some of your dollars, or most of them, and loan those dollars out to somebody else. So you put $100 in, they take 90 bucks of that and loan it out to somebody else. Maybe this goes to a mortgage, a credit card, an auto loan, but in many cases, they loan it to the US government. Now, whoever gets those dollars from that loan is also going to spend those dollars, whether it goes to a mortgage or an auto loan or the government. That money then gets spent. Every time those dollars get spent, guess where it goes? Somebody else's bank account. So your dollars that you deposited got loaned out, wound up in somebody else's bank account. From there, that bank will take most of those dollars and loan them out. They will work their way through, eventually ending up as a deposit in somebody else's bank account. This is how fractional reserve banking works. This is called rehypothecation, where the same dollar gets loaned out over and over and over again. And basically you have $1 turning into many dollars in the overall financial system. Now, you and everyone along this chain, when you go log into your bank account, you will all see that you have those dollars, and it will tell you you can get those dollars out at any time. But if any single bank has everybody try and go get their dollars, they can't get their dollars. And this is why bank runs happen, like we saw with Silicon Valley Bank a few years ago. Everybody tried to get their dollars, but the dollars aren't actually there. It says they're there on your statements, but they're not. Those dollars have been loaned out and are actually in somebody else's bank account. So this is fractional reserve banking, and this is the main way that dollars are created. It is through the banking system because money is lent into existence. It used to be the case that when money would expand or credit would expand and the money supply would grow as a result of that credit expansion, eventually that process would reverse. At some point, growth would slow down, people would start paying off their debt, and the money supply would actually contract. That's why when we talk about growth, we talk about expansions and contractions because of what's happening with the money supply. But in recent decades, policymakers don't like the contractions. They want to stop that from happening. So when there is something that could cause a contraction, they'll do something like lower rates, do some quantitative easing in order to try and keep that borrowing and spending train going. This eventually causes larger problems that lead to things like bank runs. But even then, policymakers don't want that to happen because it could spiral out of control and you could have a bank run at every bank in the entire system. And so what the Federal Reserve does then at that point is they do create money out of thin air. The Federal Reserve does this. Keep in mind, this is different than the government. And they create that money in order to put those dollars back into those bank accounts wherever the bank run is happening. In other words, they bail out the depositors so that anybody trying to get their money out will be able to get it out. And then everybody will be like, oh, well, I don't need to get it out because it's actually there. So remember, the money wasn't there. It was loaned out somewhere else, but then the Federal Reserve prints enough money to back up those deposits. So this is the first way that the Federal Reserve comes comes into play. The Federal Reserve will come into play to back up the banking system when that fractional reserve banking and rehypothecation goes too far and ends up risking a large contraction of the money supply. You can think of the Federal Reserve as if it's just the bank for other banks. So that's why they are able to do this, because they just create the reserves and credit those reserves to the bank's accounts that are held at the Federal Reserve. It'd be similar to you logging into Chase Bank and somebody just types in on the computer and credits your account with an extra $10,000. That's essentially what the Federal Reserve is doing to the bank's bank accounts at the Fed. Now, the second thing that the Federal Reserve itself does in order to print money is it buys assets from other banks. And so historically, they have bought treasuries and mortgage-backed securities. These are assets that were in the financial system that the Federal Reserve buys from those institutions. So the Federal Reserve will create cash, dollars, money injected into the financial system by buying those assets from banks. They buy a treasury from bank. Now that bank no longer has that treasury. That treasury sits on the balance sheet of the Fed, but now the bank has that cash. And many times what they'll do is the bank will turn around and they will buy another treasury, in other words, loan that money to the US government. And in so doing, the Federal Reserve, by buying assets out of the economy, they are creating new money, injecting that money into the economy, and then those dollars end up getting circulated. They go back into circulation. They end up as deposits in accounts, and that increases the money supply. So far, everything that I'm telling you is very well known. This is how the system works, and it's not a shock to anybody. When the government spends money into existence so far, they're just borrowing it from banks, and that's where the money creation comes from. If that borrowing ends up going too far, the Federal Reserve will come in and back up the system and print the money for what was not actually there. So what Elon Musk is describing he found is very different than what we have all known and what we have all seen for a long time here. The Federal Reserve is very different than the federal government. What he is saying is that the federal government has payment systems that make payments that are not coming from anywhere. In other words, they are doing the thing that Congress gave the Federal Reserve the power to do. Now, the reason why this is strange is because payments coming from the United States government are supposed to come from the Treasury General account. The Treasury General government, and it is volatile, but this is where tax money goes into. This is when they borrow and issue debt. This is where the money flows into. And then when they make payments, this is where it comes out of. And so this account will fluctuate both up and down. And this account is a bank account held at the Federal Reserve, which means that when the US government makes payments and those bank accounts, whoever they're paying, receive those dollars, it says it's coming from the US government, but it's not actually coming from anywhere. According to this, there's no transfer of dollars coming out of the United States government's checking account, which means there's no reconciliation that's happening. There's no balancing out and looking at the balance sheets, looking at the transactions and saying, okay, well, these banks received all this money. Where did it come from? Well, it came from the government, but the government didn't have a net debit of the same amount. And so nobody's actually looking at this. And that has led to the ability of the US government to simply make payments that are coming from nowhere. This means it is not part of the budget. It is not being borrowed. It is not being taxed. It is the US government itself creating dollars through payments. Now, after these payments are made, this will show up in the money supply. And once those dollars are created, they do end up working their way through the economy and overall have a net effect of pushing up prices of goods and services and assets. Now, of course, this is all else being equal, which is never the case. So that is the pressure they apply in the economy. Does not mean that prices will always actually absolutely go up. It just means they are higher than they would be otherwise. And it also looks like these payments are coming to an end, and usually they amounted to a 5 to 10% difference in the amount of money the US government was supposed to be spending in those areas. But a 5 to 10% difference is actually pretty big. When you consider the US government spends $5, $6, $7 trillion every single year. That's potentially $700 billion worth of payments that have literally been printed or paid into existence. That is why it is so inflationary, because if they tax the money, at least they're taking that money from one area and spending it somewhere else, which means on net, there's no more increase of dollars, so it's not inflationary overall. It causes misallocation of resources and malinvestments and a bunch of other problems, but at least an overall inflation is not one of those problems. Even when they borrow, yes, that money is being lent into existence, but an asset and a liability is created at that same time, and plus interest added in overall means over the long term that debt inherently shouldn't be overall inflationary. The reason it turns inflationary in the end is because eventually the money supply increases through something like the Federal Reserve's quantitative easing. But what Elon is describing here, the government just issuing payments from nowhere, from nothing, new dollars coming into existence, is outright straight up inflationary. And the good news is the discovery of this means that it's probably just come to an end. Doesn't mean those payments themselves are going to stop, but it does mean that those payments will probably be coming from the Treasury General account, which means that ultimately, if they continue, they have to be funded either through taxing or borrowing. Now, those payments probably should be stopped anyway, but at least it's a step in the right direction to have them actually come from somewhere rather than nowhere. Because you can't fix something if you don't even know it's happening in the first place. As always, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.